Well, no, but I mean, I don't. If everyone's got an example, I'll just keep it as a double reference so that we can, for when we fill in the actual ballot papers. How long do you think the chair guy's going to be? To be honest, we're quite pushed for time. If he doesn't come back, I think I might just chair. Yeah, great. Okay, so, Posh, can you just shut the door?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Okay, welcome everybody to round one of the 2008 World Schools Debating Championships. The motion before us is this House supports military intervention to deliver emergency aid in humanitarian crises. Speaking for the proposition, we have Team Israel, Moshe Rosenstein, Batzion Ben David, and Benji Kalman. Please welcome them. Speaking in opposition for Team South Africa, we have Daniel Galiski, Ilan Price, and Mark Sherman. Please welcome them. Your judges are me, Michael, and Daphne.
And the grandparents. Oh! That's good.
Sure.
Thanks. And you make a fun. Sure.
So, without much further ado, it gives me great pleasure to call upon Moshe to open the case for the proposition.
Last May, a deadly cyclone struck the nation of Myanmar, killing thousands and leaving hundreds of thousands without food, water, and shelter. Now, the nations of the world, governments and non-governmental aid organizations alike, rallied to help. However, the government of Myanmar refused aid inside its borders while not dealing with the crisis themselves. And we in the proposition believe that in such a situation, then as a last resort, military intervention is required to provide the aid. And we will be presenting our case to you today under the team line that military intervention to provide aid as a last resort is justified and can be effective. And that's what we're going to be proving to you. I will be dealing with the first two sections of that, the fact that intervention is justified and that it will be effective, and our second speaker will go on to provide analysis of why our plan is the best option. Now, before we do that, let's just clear up the terms of this motion. When we say humanitarian crisis, what we mean is some form of natural disaster, such as a disease, a famine, or a hurricane that threatens lives on a massive scale. What we're not talking about here are things such as genocide, or ethnic cleansing, or things of that nature. No, thank you. Because under international law and the United Nations Charter, these situations already justify intervention. Intervention in these cases is status quo. Now, the second term of this debate is emergency aid, and this is fairly clear. What we mean is food and medicine that is provided by non-governmental aid organizations such as the Red Cross or Doctors Without Borders. Now, let's explain exactly what our mechanism here today is, what we're proposing should happen. Basically, what we want to have is step one. The United Nations adds the emergency situations that we described to the criteria that invoke the concept of responsibility to protect, which I will explain in a moment in my first speech. Basically what that means is that all of the rules, the procedures, and the considerations that currently apply before responsibility to protect can be invoked. No, thank you, will also apply in these situations. So what that practically means is that the United Nations will declare that in the future, any nation that refuses to allow aid to reach its citizens in the case of a crisis will be in violation of the United Nations Charter and therefore open to intervention by United Nations force. No, thank you. What that means is that, as a last resort, once all attempts to bring in the aid have failed, then, no thank you, the forces of the United Nations Standby Arrangement System, or UNSAS for short, will escort the NGOs into the borders to the crisis zone, and the NGOs will there provide the aid. And as soon as the NGOs declare that the crisis has been averted, all the forces will move out. We'd also like to stress that these forces will not initiate any action on their own, and will only take action to defend themselves and to defend the aid. All right, so now that we've made clear the plan, let's move on to our first argument, explaining why intervention is morally and legally justified. Now, the clash between the sovereignty of nations and interventionism is not new. All the way back in 1948, the United Nations Charter recognized that sovereignty is almost holy, but there are exceptions. Back then, no thank you, the exception that was stated was external threats to world peace and security. These legally allow intervention, and this has happened before in Iraq in '91 in the first Gulf War, in Kosovo, etc., and there's a long list of other examples. Now, in 2005, the UN reformed and expanded this idea with the concept of responsibility to protect. Basically what that means is the UN stated that it is also justified to intervene in cases of internal threats, when the government is not protecting its people from some form of internal crisis. Basically, What this means is that with sovereignty over a nation, no thank you, the government also has a responsibility to protect the people from threats that come from internally. And the threats that were outlined in this document that describe responsibility to protect were genocide, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Now this document, we'd like to stress, was ratified by the entire UN, no thank you, 150 nations, well actually more, all the nations in the world accepted that this was correct, that intervention should be legal in this case. So we see that in the case of genocide or ethnic cleansing or crimes against humanity, intervention is accepted and justified. Now, we have to ask, why was this concept of responsibility to protect not invoked in the case of Myanmar, when the government, when the government was actively allowing its citizens to die? Please.
Well, sir, if China can simply veto you, as they did in many cases, such as in Sudan, any time you want to have this resolution, what's the point of your policy?
Well, actually, although it was everybody thought that China would veto any action against Sudan, we actually saw that China did allow a motion to pass that allowed a certain amount of forces to enter Sudan. So we see that the reactions of the members of the Security Council can't be so easily predicted. And also we believe that we'll actually do an analysis of the reason why we don't think these motions will be vetoed, but we'll get to that later in our case. So to get back to my point, why was responsibility to protect not invoked in Myanmar when the government was allowing its citizens to die? And the reason is rather trivial, simply because natural disasters are not included in the list of what is of when R2P applies. It's a very specific list, as we said, only genocide and crimes against humanity. And we think this is rather arbitrary, ladies and gentlemen, because practically what it means is that if murderer number 1 is ravaging a nation, in this case, no thank you, perhaps a human being, then intervention is justified. But if murderer number 2 is ravaging the nation, in this case a cyclone, then intervention is absolutely not justified. And we don't think that's all right. We have to ask the question, no thank you, why is there a difference? In both cases, the same criteria apply. There is massive death. The population is helpless. And the government has a legal and moral duty, no thank you, to protect its citizens. There's a 100% match in both the cases of crimes against humanity and the case of a natural disaster. Why should intervention be justified as it is today by all the nations of the world, no thank you, in one case and not in the other? We ask the opposition why, no thank you, and we can actually tell you the answer. It should be justified in both. So now I've cleared out why intervention in the cases of natural disaster is legally and morally justified under the current standards of international law and the UN Charter, let's move on to explain why the practical results of our proposition will really be effective. Now, first we have to ask ourselves, when is this proposition relevant? What kind of nations will actually refuse aid when it is offered? Now, it's not going to be democracies. It's not going to be nations that really care about their people. And it's not even going to be in countries that are active in the international community. For example, China back in the 1970s was an isolationist regime, and when an earthquake struck them, they refused outside aid. However, when recently, last May, a devastating earthquake struck China, they accepted aid gladly from all comers because they had opened up, because they had ties in the international community, and they recognized that it was important. So we see that the situation we're discussing can only really arise in a very small number of nations that are ruled by ultra-selfish, paranoid dictators. For example, Myanmar, where the junta is in power. For example, perhaps Zimbabwe under Mugabe. Maybe there are one or two other examples. Now, these kind of dictators have really only one main interest. They want to stay in power. They want to keep control over their nation. And so, in an emergency, in the case of a natural disaster, they will take whatever course of action is least likely to threaten their power. So, let's take a look inside their heads and ask, why does the Myanmar junta, no thank you, not allow aid when the cyclone struck them? Well, they had a balance inside their heads. On the one hand, no thank you, they suspected that these Red Cross workers might be agents of the West, trying to undermine their power. And also they didn't want to appear helpless before their people as showing that only the outside world was providing aid. So that was their concerns. And on the other side, they saw that if they didn't let the aid in, absolutely nothing would happen. So it was fairly easy for them to decide to refuse the aid. However, under our proposition, it looks a little bit different. Because now, on the one hand, they do have the risk of the Red Cross workers being CIA agents, but on the other hand, they have the threat of a UN force, morally and legally backed by the entire world, moving into their nation and delivering the aid anyway. And so we believe that these leaders will make the balance in their head and realize that in the end, it's more worthwhile for them to avoid the conflict with the United Nations, with the United Nations forces that are represented by the entire world, and simply allow the aid to come in peacefully and declare themselves the saviors of their people. So we see that by changing the balance of considerations in the head of the dictators, our plan will effectively convince them to let the aid in peacefully. So what have we told you today? We've shown you that intervention as a last resort is both morally justified and effective. Thank you.
I thank Moshe very much for that speech. We're now going to call upon the first speaker for the opposition representing Team South Africa, and that is Daniel Kaliski.
Right, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Now, what we on Team South Africa are not going to contend is that we need to do something about people who are suffering. We're not simply going to say, yes, let's leave the weakest of the weak on the side of the road. But what we are going to contend very strongly is that it's proposition's policy that hurts them the most. It's proposition's policy that sacrifices the weak on the claim that we want to protect them. It has risks in the short term and the long term that sacrifice these weak people in horrendous ways, and in fact frustrates our ability in the present and the future to deliver successful and sustainable aid in the here and now. It also undermines alternative methods, which there are, which proposition have ignored, of helping the situation that do not have these same risks, such as diplomacy, such as we've seen work in Myanmar, where they did in fact eventually accept this when China stepped in as a mediator. We don't need to prove, however, that those alternatives are better. All we need to prove is that proposition's alternative is not the one that we want. So now let's deal, before coming to the case of the opposition, with the case set forward by the proposition today. Now, let's deal with the issue of the definition of the policy that they dealt with first, and then I'm going to go on to the issue of their effectiveness. Now, firstly, they said to us that they were going to try and expand the responsibility to protect, but this is simply not the case. In fact, if anything, they're removing the cases which responsibility to protect would in fact take place, i.e. where governments are abusing their own people directly, and they're simply going to shift it to another area where natural disasters are in fact present. So there's all these cases where they say, no, we're not going to intervene to help these people, we don't care about them, it's only when it's a natural disaster that we're going to intervene. And we fundamentally don't find that these cases have any kind of special justification that we brought from the proposition. But what we find, in fact, is the implication of this is that there are, in fact, vanishingly few cases where they're going to be using this. In fact, they wanted to do this through the UN, a body that is notorious for being slow, for taking long time to reach decisions, for having vetoed many different kinds of resolutions in the past, and simply asserting, oh, China eventually allowed a small number of troops to Sudan, isn't good enough. Because for many, many years, China vetoed again and again any kind of humanitarian aid, not just military intervention into Sudan. And when a country can do that, then you're going to be finding this policy used in very, very few circumstances. But what we find as well, coming up to the point of effectiveness as well, is that they've simply asserted that, oh, it's going to be okay, because as long as we have the standing army in there protecting the aid workers, everything will be okay. Well, we asked them. Whether the mechanism that they've shown us is actually there. Because we've seen the most powerful army in the world, the United States, in Iraq and Afghanistan, that has shown us complete incapability of defending the most strategic elements of humanitarian crises. And in fact, it's because that warfare isn't so simple as moving troops into a location and simply protecting people in a nominal way. War is very messy. It has to do with armies protecting strategic locations. Often they are in places where people try to outsmart them, where people, like the Taliban in Afghanistan, can simply retreat to the hills and come back for you at any point. It's not that you have this omniscient force that is everywhere at all times and can protect people. So we find that that is a link that wasn't made by proposition. So now let's talk about the case that opposition is going to bring to you today. I'm going to be talking about the short-term consequences of proposition's policy, how it in fact hurts the people they claim to want to help. And secondly, my second speaker is going to be dealing with the long-term consequences and the damage done by the policy. So coming now to this issue of, firstly, the implications of risking proposition's policy, and secondly, I'll be going on to the issue of reprisals. Now, with proposition's policy, what we find is that there's a scarcity of resources in aid, even where it does go through. And some aid does go through in Myanmar and Zimbabwe, we contend, even where governments do refuse the aid. It's not a black and white. It's not, as propositions say, there's not just no aid or some aid. No, thank you, sir. What we find, however, is that this option is extremely expensive because of the cost of military hardware and transportation. As we've seen in the Iraq War, which cost $400 billion for the United States government over the past 5 years. However, this isn't simply that we're going to say, oh, it's too expensive, let's not do it. What we do say, however, is on proposition to justify that it's worth the opportunity cost of the alternatives and the opportunity cost that's presented to us in terms of the money and resources that could be used in other ways. But now let's come to this point of reprisals. Now, all we heard from proposition side of the House was about how governments are more likely to accept aid because it's good for them. Meanwhile, they gave us a very clear example of a government that doesn't want intervention from the outside world, that doesn't want even aid workers coming in. So we asked them, why would it be the case that a government would want to accept an invading force, a military intervening force in their country? Why would they?
We told you, because if the alternative is the United Nations completely attacking them, they'll probably want the aid.
Well, frankly, now, all you show with that is that they will want to protect themselves. It's not that they will want to necessarily try and accept the aid. What in fact you are trying to show us is that they want to protect themselves, and by protecting themselves, that means they're more likely to become more militarized, more likely to become more belligerent, they're more likely to do stuff that is going to be likely to want them to that prevent them from getting invaded more in the future, and more likely to eradicate the force that's coming in. So what happens in fact with how it harms the people on the ground is that it does it in two ways. Firstly, it harms them in terms of violence direct to the people who receive the aid, or secondly, it harms them in terms of broader conflict. Now, as I've already shown you, the state isn't just going to be like, well, we're going to accept this aid because we don't want to be invaded. They're going to be very belligerent because you're going to have shown them that they are frail. You're going to have shown them their interests are unimportant. You're going to have shown them that sovereignty doesn't matter. This is fundamentally important for states that used to be former colonies, ladies and gentlemen. What we find is that there's very often a very good excuse for them to kill recipients of aid and to make sure that their efforts against these people are redoubled. In fact, they were given the incentive to use them as political tools. As we saw in Somalia, when the Somalian army eradicated entire refugee camps on the Ethiopian border, when the US intervened on the excuse that they were eradicating the American Kurds. They will also want to show their superiority of the invading force, as the Afghan Taliban forces did when the USSR intervened in that country. So it becomes an idea of showing that you are better than these people. But most of all, what we decry is that the use of these people being held hostage, even in cases where you have natural disasters, as a political tool to show your sovereignty, to reassert your dominance in that area. So we fundamentally don't find that propositions policy incentivizing that kind of behavior is something that is for the benefit of these people that they presumably want to help. Coming now to this issue of broader conflict. What we have in fact in the short term and the long term is we escalate broader conflict when we intervene militarily in an area. What we find is that people not only want to assert their defensive capability when you intervene militarily in an area, but because you violate their sovereignty, but in addition to this, it often becomes about territory. When it becomes about territory, when it becomes about how much land I can take away from you, how much further I can push back your troops, then what it becomes about is an issue of brinkmanship and and this tends to lead to an escalation of violence. We saw this in Kashmir when India and Pakistan were constantly playing a game with one another, seeing how far they could push the other back into the other's territory, and that escalated conflict to horrendous scale. So what we find as well is that this conflict does a few things in terms of harming humanitarian crises. Firstly, civilians die in the course of it. Secondly, it becomes a regional conflict because conflicts like these tend to spill over borders. So it's no longer a localized problem where you've had a tsunami and suddenly some civilians have died. It's now a problem involving a country that is embroiled in broader conflict. But most of all, what is important is that the infrastructure of that country suffers. And when that infrastructure of that country suffers, as we saw in Iraq, as we saw when the only places that were protected were the oil pipelines and the roads and the railways were completely destroyed, we find that destroys your ability to produce and to relieve people in the future. It destroys your ability to deliver this emergency aid when you need to in the future and the present. It also means it's more likely people are going to need this emergency aid in the future, and we contend. So what we find is that when we conclude this case, we find that when propositions policy is implemented, what we do is in fact harm the very people we intend to help. We incentivize the abuse of the civilians that we're trying to help. Secondly, if there's a broader, less controllable conflict that ensues because of this policy. And thirdly, it incentivizes behavior that in fact makes it more difficult for you to intervene in the present and in the future. Because of these things that hurt the civilians that you're trying to help, we beg to oppose this motion.
I thank Daniel very much for that speech. We're now going to move to the second speaker for Team Israel, Batsim Ben-David.
We on Team Proposition find it very ironic that the opposition team here can really focus on a few casualties and ignore the larger picture, because somehow the few casualties that will be killed if war will ensue is a terrible thing. But hundreds of thousands of people buried under rubble somehow does not carry the same weight. And we find this is very inconsistent and very disturbing to hear on the side of proposition, because we heard that there are alternatives that are better, but the opposition won't tell us that they're better. It was very confusing. I'm going to get to that in a minute. I'm going to separate my refutation into two groups today. I'm going to talk about the refutation that we heard to our case, and then I'll talk about the refutation to the substantive case of the opposition. So the first thing we heard was something like this, was that there are alternatives, but we won't tell you what they are. There's something to do with diplomacy. We don't have to tell you that they're better, and we find this confusing, because we heard that we won't let the people die, and there is some sort of alternative, but it might not be better than military intervention. And really, this is very confusing to me specifically and to the whole proposition. So until we get that clarified, we really cannot understand, because it sounds like right now you are leaving them to die or to get them some aid. No, thank you. Then we heard a misrepresentation of our team, because we were told that we're shifting the responsibility to protect, when this is clearly not true. What we've told you, Moshe said it very clearly, that we're going to continue to intervene when it makes sense. When we see in cases of genocide, when the UN decides this is a good action, they will go forward. And we're just extending that to also humanitarian crises. And this was a complete misrepresentation of our case. We heard that the United Nations is slow and has veto powers, and I'll get to that, to the fact that they're slow, I'll get to in my speech. But this idea of a veto power, which was made a really big deal in a point of information and in the speech. And we have three answers for that. The first answer, which Moshe already gave, is surprise, surprise. China did not veto everything that has to do with Darfur, because they do have some sense. The next thing we say is like this, that the countries veto something because they fear it will set a precedent for them. For example, China and Russia will veto anything that has to do with condemning countries with human rights abuses, because it will set a precedent for people to condemn them. The United States will protect Israel. No, thank you. When it comes to fighting terrorism, because they do the same thing. But this is a case where China will not set any dangerous precedent for themselves if they let us intervene. No, thank you. So we find this irrelevant. And the last answer is really that we don't really care, as we believe that it should happen. If we have to convince China that's a different thing, if that's the only problem, that China will veto, then really you agree it's justified and it is a good idea, and all we have to do is talk to China. No, thank you. And then we heard this idea about territory, which played in both ideas. And we're going to say that the United States were ineffective in Iraq because they're trying to topple and rebuild a regime. And this is not the case we're talking about today. What we're talking about is going in. It was very clearly stated, no thank you, and it was ignored. The fact that we're going to go in, we're going to give the aid, and when the crisis is averted, we're going to leave. When people, are out of the rubble, we're getting out of there, yes.
And how are these militaries specifically designed to administer the aid that you're talking about?
Well, I'm not going to demonstrate now with the gun, but the idea is very clear. The aid is going to go in, the military personnel will protect them, will follow them, will make sure they get to the people, will make sure they have time to clear them out. I'm not sure we have to give you the schedule exactly day by day, so it's not very clear to me. And then we have this idea of that some aid does go through, and we would like to know exactly what some aid means, so I don't expect you to give me a number, but we see that when thousands and thousands of people are still buried under the rubble, no thank you, and still starving and sick, we don't think that some aid is enough, because that's all we had from the opposition. And then we heard a few ideas about the idea that there's going to be, no thank you, that we heard something like this. We heard that they're going to use it, it's going to escalate, everything's going to get much worse, and we really have a few answers to that. We first of all say that the situation there is already really, 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 really bad. And this was kind of ignored, no thank you, on the opposition. The situation there is incredibly, incredibly horrible. We heard this idea of territory, and we say that the only person who is not going to fight territory is the United Nations. So this idea of battling for territory is irrelevant, because the military are not going to occupy, no thank you. They're going to go in and go out. They have no territory needs. And then the last thing I'm going to do before I get on to my point is the opposition didn't accept the idea that the dictator are actually going to let the aid in without the military intervention. I'd like to reiterate it, because it really was, coming down? Okay. Because it really wasn't clear. And this is what Moshe said, and it was really ignored by the opposition. The fact is that we have a debate in the dictator's mind. Either he let the aid in, and as we said, let the evil CIA agents in who are dressed as Doctors Without Borders. Or we can, no thank you, do nothing and then everything's great. But I, the evil dictator, would like to stay in power. So that's fine with me. But if the debate is different, if I'm given a dilemma like this, if I'm told either the CIA evil agents, who are also Doctors Without Borders, will come into my land and maybe they'll do something terrible, or they'll come in with the whole force of the United Nations and they'll topple and they'll scare me and they'll ruin my credibility and my power. Because I want to stay in power, I will let them in. In other words, we're making it worth it. No, thank you. Worth it for the dictator to let the aid in. The example is Kenya. When Kenya had the civil war in their land, and Kofi Annan tried to negotiate, and then he said, "Forget it. I'm leaving. I'm not negotiating. Next time you hear from the UN, it will be a very different context." Surprise, surprise. 2 days later, they reached a negotiation, and the United Nations senior officials said it was undoubtedly because Kenya knew that if they don't get to a settlement, then the responsibility to protect will be activated, and they will be in a whole lot of trouble. And now to get to my point, no thank you, because we heard that the UN is really completely incompetent and not really helpful at all. So we've told you that, I'm going to tell you now why the UN really is the best option compared to the not really substantive alternatives that we heard from the opposition today. First of all, we already explained to you that principally they have the right, and principally they're the only organization with the moral and legal right to intervene. They're the only one with the consensus of the world behind it. They're the only organization that is not in search of territory. So really we think they're a perfect idea. No, thank you. And then we have this idea that the United Nations is too slow and too bureaucratic. And we would say that you, the opposition, are living in the past. Because in 2000, the Brahimi reform was made, and it led to huge changes. It led to the response time going from a whole year to 30 days. The United Nations is ready to move in 30 days, and that is without them needing to act in humanitarian crises. And we believe that once they get the additional demand, they will be able to rise to that challenge. If they manage to get it down from a year to 30 days, they can do an even better job. So really we have a United Nations that is much faster than the opposition remembers from many years ago. They are also the quality of the forces, the quality of the weapons that they have and the soldiers has gone much better. We have the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, and they are well organized with military advisors, with everyone 1 minute they need, and they have better equipment, sure.
But this benefit of being faster and stronger is only applicable once they're able to go in, once they've got the consent and not being vetoed. That's the point.
Well, as I really said that already, that first of all, we had 3 very good answers to the veto. The fact is that it doesn't really matter if they veto, and they probably won't veto for 2 answers. And really that is something we already addressed. So we said that really they are ready to move. They can move, they can do a good job, and they're the only people who don't have all the agendas behind them. So they're only people who can actually do it. And as Moshe already said, and I'm going to continue to say, the UN won't, the dictators won't want to attack the United Nations military force, because the people in the military force are their neighbors. They're the people around them who they don't want to bother, because those neighbors have so far been leaving them alone. So quickly to summarize this debate, we first of all heard nothing really substantive when it comes to alternative, except the fact that they maybe possibly might exist. We've told you over and over again that the dictator will want to accept the aid when the threat comes of military intervention. And we've told you time and time again that the UN is the only option, the best option to get this job. I beg you to propose.
I thank Batsian very much and look to the second speaker for the opposition, Ilan Price.
Right, now ladies and gentlemen, as mentioned by my first speaker, today in my speech I'm going to be dealing with the long-term harms of the proposition's policy that they put forward today. But before I move on to my positive matter, I'd like to deal with 4 main areas of rebuttal. Firstly, this issue of alternatives. Secondly, the idea of justification. Thirdly, the idea of effectiveness, and fourthly, a moral tension that we've seen arising from the case proposition. So let's get straight onto this this issue of alternatives. And really, it shouldn't actually be such a big issue in today's debate, because what they've come up and told us is that as the opposition, we have to be here proposing a specific alternative. But ladies and gentlemen, what we find is that that just isn't the case. We do propose that there are alternatives out there, and I will be getting to the necessity of things like diplomacy in my positive manner. But what we see is that we're in opposition today. What we have to prove is that their policy as a proposition is more harmful than beneficial. The harms outweigh the detriments, and therefore it is something which should not be implemented, ladies and gentlemen, and we are successfully doing this. So let's move on, secondly, to this idea of justification. And basically, they spent a lot of time going on about why this is good and why it's justified. But basically, the crux of the argument was that, well, because it's for the best of the people. And basically, what this means is that all of that matter rests on the idea of effectiveness, that this is actually going to be in the best interest of the people. So let's move on to the idea of effectiveness. And what we'd said as the opposition is that the proposition's policy isn't actually going to be done in as many cases as they want it to be done.
Sir.
No, thank you. What they came up and they gave us an argument about the UN. The UN is actually effective. UN will actually be doing things. But ladies and gentlemen, this is fundamentally flawed. We brought you the idea of veto power, and the fact that the UN Security Council is so complicated and it has so many members and has so many vested interests in them that it actually just hardly ever gets anything done. So what they said is basically they only veto when there's an interest. And what we say is that China actually, in the region of Southeast Asia, has interest in maintaining these regimes or these dictatorships in essence of either being just in essence of regional stability, but also in terms of the fact that they're actually allies with some of the countries in the first place. No, thank you. But what we also say is that what they propose is taking a long time to do it. And as I'm going to point out in a few minutes, that's actually a contradiction in their case in the first place. But also, ladies and gentlemen, what we say is that there's their policy in terms of the UN is actually going to be counterproductive. Why, ladies and gentlemen? Because the EU, a large part of the UN, is actually fundamentally against invading sovereignty at all costs a lot of the time. But what we also see is that they're the major contributors to humanitarian aid in these types of emergency humanitarian crises. And what we see is you're going to lose a lot of the contribution of this kind of aid to be given by the UN because of this offence to that invading of sovereignty and the belief therein of the EU. So let's move on to this last issue, and that's the issue of this moral tension. Because what we see is that the proposition comes up today, and they say they don't mind if it takes a long time. As we've proven, there is going to take a long time in terms of the UN. They don't mind that they're going to take a long time to convince China, or take a long time to actually get the aid in, or whatever it may be, but ladies and gentlemen. But they've also come up and said that, no, but we want intervention now. Intervention is very important. These people are suffering, and they mustn't be allowed to suffer. What we see is that they've got to make a choice. They've got to make a choice. No, they've got to make a choice between whether they want, whether the time and being taking time and being safe is the best option, or and therefore not going in unilateral and only unilaterally and through the UN as they suggest, or, ladies and gentlemen, doing this quick and saving and actually getting what they want done. Because in terms of if they're looking at the long term, there actually are better alternatives, ladies and gentlemen. So having dealt with my rebuttal, let me move on to my positive matter. And as I said, what I'm going to be dealing with is the long-term harms of the proposition's policy. And I'm going to be dealing with one main argument, and that's this argument of decreasing political space. So let's get right into it. What I'm going to be proving to you is that the proposition are going to be harming the prospects of future dialogue and successful negotiations, and that's what we want. So why is it that we want these negotiations in the future? Why? Because we contend, ladies and gentlemen, that it's the best way to achieve a long-term and sustainable solution. We point actually to the example that they keep mentioning about Myanmar. The fact that through political pressure, through sustained political pressure negotiations, in fact they're now allowing more of the aid in without this assumed necessary military intervention that the proposition wants. However, ladies and gentlemen, what we see is that this ability to negotiate in the future is especially important in the context of humanitarian crises. Why, ladies and gentlemen? Because fundamentally they often occur in the same region. Seeing as they've limited it to things like natural disasters, what we say is that often natural disasters happen in the same places recurringly. Places are actually geographically prone to and natural disasters, and the examples would be places like Southeast Asia. And what we see is that in that regard, the need for political space in which to negotiate in the future is going to be essentially important. No, thank you. So, how is a propositions policy going to be harming these prospects of future negotiation and compromise? Well, we say it harms it in two ways. Firstly, in terms of compromise, and secondly, in credibility, and we're going to deal with them separately. Firstly, in terms of compromise, what we have to understand is because of the nature of intervention, it is so offensive, it is so demeaning to that country, having your sovereignty invaded as such, as touched on by my first speaker, it indicates a severe lack of compromise.
Sir.
And I'll take you in a moment, sir, on the part of the country intervening. And what we'd say is that fundamentally harms the political relations between two countries, and creates hostility and increases the gap between the two countries. So,
political relations are very important, but you may fail to understand that we have a situation where hundreds of thousands of people are dying of starvation and disease. We need to help them now.
well, firstly, ladies and gentlemen, we have shown you that they're actually not helping them now, and actually one of the lines in their speech actually agreed that we're not helping them now. But what we'd also say is that because these humanitarian crises may recur, that we have to help them in the long term as well, ladies and gentlemen. We have to be looking to long-term sustainable solutions in order to help, because, ladies and gentlemen, the short term now, the long term now will be the short term in 10 or 20 years' time, ladies and gentlemen. So basically what we see is that because you've created this hostility between the two countries, you decrease the amount of political space for this kind of negotiation, something which I assume they now agree is very important. But what we say, ladies and gentlemen, is that prevents your ability, for example, to negotiate aid without going in with the military, therefore preventing all the reprisals and stuff that my first speaker spoke about. And ladies and gentlemen, in terms of political space and the benefit of taking a more passive stance, we'd point to the example of South Africa's policy on Zimbabwe. And what we'd say is that in fact the passive stance that South Africa has taken on Zimbabwe has actually bought its political space to negotiate, to go through with trying to find a solution in a more diplomatic way, ladies and gentlemen. And while we'd say it isn't perfect, firstly, we'd point to the fact that recently much more aid has been allowed in without the need for military intervention, but also, ladies and gentlemen, that it would be much worse had we militarily intervened in, let's say, 2000. We would be in a much worse situation in terms of reprisals, but we'd also have lost the opportunity to go through with negotiations and get the aid in other means, ladies and gentlemen. What we'd say is that if you compare that to the EU in terms of sanctions, when they've taken a stance, they've removed their political space. So, ladies and gentlemen, in terms of compromise, we'd see that they're going to be much less willing to compromise because of the offence of the intervention. So let's move quickly on to this issue of credibility. And what we'd say is that these governments fundamentally want to retain some kind of credibility, something that they've agreed to. But, ladies and gentlemen, what we see is that if you appear to have caved in to this military pressure, what we see is that they wouldn't. This is fundamentally harming to their image, and therefore, because of this, after military intervention, they aren't going to want to come to some kind of conclusion because of the perception that they're caving to this pressure. Ladies and gentlemen, what I've shown you is that you're going to have a decrease in the possibility of negotiations in the future, and this is fundamentally very bad. It's very bad for the people that they actually want to help, ladies and gentlemen. The weakest of the weak, the people who are going to need a sustained context in which they don't need emergency aid. Ladies and gentlemen, for all of these reasons, we must oppose.
I thank Ellen very much for that speech, and now look to Benji to continue the case for Singapore.
The main problem that South Africa has had with our case is that the problem is these countries become very belligerent and, not like the world very much and won't come to some kind of conclusion. What conclusion here? This isn't a negotiation over peace. This isn't us trying to remove the regime. What we're trying to do here is merely get in there, save the crisis, and then leave. This is why we don't think that it matters so much if the country then, is annoyed with the UN, and quite frankly, ladies and gentlemen, the countries that we're talking about today are countries who already don't have such a great standing in the UN, are countries that are actually enemies with almost all the countries around them. And more importantly, if they were to attack these forces, well, these forces are made up of all the troops that are around them, because South Africa, Nigeria, India are all the people who put troops inside the UN forces. So they would have to actually attack South Africa. I don't think Zimbabwe really wants to do that. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask you 3 questions here. The first is there a better alternative? Because actually, when we're talking about the fact that hundreds of thousands of people are going to die, no thank you sir, we actually want to hear what is the better situation to be put into effect. No thanks sir. Finally, will the UN act? Will the UN actually be able to act? Because they came time and time again and said, veto. And thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, what will the country's reaction be? The country that is being invaded. So ladies and gentlemen, let's start off, is there a better alternative? Yes, ladies and gentlemen, if diplomacy works, then great. Just like we're not going to invade a country, which is having some sort of civil war. If diplomacy works, then we're not going to invade a country, no thank you, where diplomacy is working and they are accepting aid. However, ladies and gentlemen, as Moshe quite clearly stated, as Batyong continued, and has been the team line of our entire case, when all other measures fail, just like any other one sector, military intervention is used when other means fail. Yes.
And when would you define a negotiation having failed? The fact that it
thank you. All right, actually, yes, it does. It fails, ladies and gentlemen, when hundreds and thousands of people are dying. The problem is that we have to deal with here today is that while we're, going through this negotiation process, which you guys also claim now will take a really long time. So I'm not sure how you can come back to us with the time issue. Then, ladies and gentlemen, people are dying in the field, ladies and gentlemen, and that is why the negotiations failed. And countries like Myanmar, no thank you, which refused any aid, ladies and gentlemen, up until the point a month later when it said you can have like 3 loaves of bread and a tiny little trickle of medication to come into our country. Thousands of people died. This isn't good enough for us. This is not a better alternative, ladies and gentlemen. When we need to, we will go in. The two are not mutually exclusive, ladies and gentlemen, because, quite frankly, we can, no thank you, provide aid to people, and we can provide aid to people, and if need be, we can also do military intervention. The fact is, most countries in the world today will accept aid, and under our plan, as Moshe said, I was never, no thank you, really come to grips with on this side is the fact that once our plan is into effect, then really no country will ever want to be invaded by an international force. So no thank you, ladies and gentlemen. So is there a better alternative? If there is one, ladies and gentlemen, we'll use it. If, however, we see that countries are not willing to come to an agreement, that it is letting thousands of people die, then just like, no thank you, under any other R2P implementation, this was not really come to agree either, the fact that countries all around the world, every country in the world, accept the fact that we do really take away sovereignty of a country which is allowing its people to die. No thank you. Secondly, will the UN act? So the first thing that we really had to deal with here was veto. But we dealt with it really quite well at the beginning, and we didn't really feel there was any sufficient answer to this on the side. So they said, ladies and gentlemen, well, China won't want to set a precedent where, Myanmar is being invaded. But ladies and gentlemen, China has nothing to fear by this. Because quite frankly, China is willing to allow aid in. China is not crazy. No, thank you. Even Iran, ladies and gentlemen, allowed aid into its country, except for, one small little country. But other than that, ladies and gentlemen, it allowed every other country in the world, including the Satan itself, the USA, in to provide aid. So ladies and gentlemen, we see the fact that China is not really so worried, maybe they'll invade me, military intervention, because I'm not providing aid to my people, because China wants to provide aid to its people, because China cares about its people, because it has good international relationships. So there's no real precedent to be set. No, thank you. And even if this was the case, we claim we still win, because we proved that it's justified, we proved that it will work. The fact that at some point, sometime, China might veto something, then quite frankly, we'll go and we'll talk around China and we'll convince them to do this, ladies and gentlemen. But as we said, we don't believe that China would ever veto this. And as we see, there are cases, such as in Sudan, where it hasn't vetoed. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, no thank you, in the UN Act, they talked about the EU. And they said, well, the EU, is very nervous to, go in and, intervene in a country. Be this as it may, every single country in the EU ratified Chapter 40 and Chapter 41 of the UN Charter. No, thank you. Where it said, we will invade when this happens. The French Prime Minister said, oh, let's go and invade Myanmar, even though it's not under RTP, because really thousands of people are dying. The fact that the EU will have cold feet and will drag feet simply isn't true. Everybody in the world recognizes when thousands and thousands, one sector, of people are dying, then is the time for sovereignty to go out the window. They no longer deserve it. Yes.
So you still haven't dealt with our matter about how this military intervention must of necessity destroy infrastructure that frustrates
the ability
to deliver aid in the first place.
Well, will the countries, well, that's what I'm going to do in my third area of clash, which leads me really quite nicely on. So we see the UN will act and can act. So what will the country's reaction be? So first of all, they ignored Moshe's point, and Martin really came back to it as well, that, well, quite frankly, we don't think there'll ever actually need to be an invasion. Because, quite frankly, let's look at this one. This is something they didn't have. They didn't have a proper analysis, no thank you sir, of what exactly goes on in a dictator's mind. Because here's the thing, the dictator wants to stay in power. The dictator wants to gain control over its people. Now, no thank you. On one hand, it can either accept aid from NGOs, which are actually willing to give it to it in unmarked boxes, so it can claim that it itself provided this aid and is the savior of their people, or on the other hand, I can get invaded by an international force. Now, you're right, maybe I'll fight them, maybe I'll even win, though we don't think this is the case, considering how technologically and how much better trained UN forces, no thank you, really are. But what shows better source of power? The fact that I was invaded, or the fact that I actually managed to help and save all my citizens, ladies and gentlemen? The fact is, they just have completely ignored this on this side, ladies and gentlemen. And then secondly, and then we have the fact that they said, well, we cause belligerence, this will be the country's reaction, belligerence and bad relations with other countries. And we say, quite frankly, most of these countries have belligerent and bad relations with the countries around them today, and this is why they're in a situation when they won't accept aid. Only someone who has a really, really bad relationship with all the world thinks that the Red Cross are CIA agents in disguise, ladies and gentlemen. These are the kind of people that you're dealing with. And ladies and gentlemen, of course we come to the final issue, which is just like Moshe said and Batsion said as well. We need to consider things. If an invasion, let's say that it's a nuclear power like North Korea, and they're going to totally destroy their entire, country, and we're not going to save people, and we're not going to save like millions of people, then maybe we won't invade. However, we believe in the majority of cases where we will go in, we will enter these places, we will not be attacked because we don't believe we will be fired upon, we don't even believe we need the intervention to begin with. Then, ladies and gentlemen, we don't really care what the country's reaction will be. So, ladies and gentlemen, is there a better alternative? No, they haven't shown us any way of actually saving these people's lives after they've ignored diplomacy. Will the UN act? Yes, because veto isn't like the golden word for everything. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, countries won't attack these troops, and they'll probably let them in to begin with. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Benji, for that speech, and now Mark to speak third for Team South Africa.
Team Israel had two burdens of proof today to prove their policy. First of all, that their policy was legitimate, and secondly, that it was effective. And this formed the two moral foundations of their case today. However, there was an inherent tension in their two burdens of proof today, ladies and gentlemen, because if, for example, we were able to prove that their policy wasn't legitimate, however effective it is irrelevant. Similarly, if we were able to prove that their policy was completely ineffective, however legitimate it was also irrelevant. And so, because today both teams conceded that there was a moral imperative to somehow deal with the humanitarian crisis, this idea of legitimacy actually fell away as an irrelevant part of today's debate. And what we would contest is that, in fact, the only moral imperative is there, is to look out for the best interests of the people in the humanitarian crisis. And so really the only piece of analysis which stood in today's debate from Team Israel was how effective their policy was going to be in alleviating the humanitarian crisis in both the short and the long term. And so that's all that's left in today's debate, and I'm going to deal with that in one lump issue of the effects of the people in these humanitarian crises. And I'm going to show you why, in fact, Team Israel hasn't proven their policy to be effective, and why, in fact, there is, in fact, a greater amount of cost that is going to be incurred on the people in these humanitarian crises. So the first justification that they gave was this idea that the United Nations is the best method to deliver this humanitarian aid. And the first issue that came up, ladies and gentlemen, in today's debate was this idea of veto powers, and the influence of veto powers and the effectiveness of this method. Now, the response to our original objection here was that regional superpowers only care about vetoing cases where they're going to be intervening militarily in cases of genocide or human rights abuses. And in fact, they wouldn't care about natural disasters because they would be willing to accept aid anyway. But what we would contest is that intervention in any case sets a precedent that in fact sovereignty isn't important. And because these countries are inherently looking out for their best interests and they don't want their own sovereignty to be violated, that they aren't necessarily going to buy into this type of policy. The second thing we see, however, ladies and gentlemen, with regards to specifically regional superpowers or neighbours, is we often find a very polarised situation in terms of relationships. Either we have the first case, where regional superpowers have very good relationships with their neighbours, in the cases of, for example, China and North Korea. There's a number of many reasons. For example, they may be selling weapons to them, or they simply want more political clout in the region because of allies. But what we would contest is that in these scenarios, it would be very unlikely that regional superpowers would actually buy into a policy of military intervention. In these cases, I'll take in a moment, ma'am. And in these cases, it would be very likely that these superpowers would actually veto this type of motion in the UN.
Would you accept that the country has allies and that ally will provide the aid, and this problem is not under this case at all?
But ma'am, what you see as the problem fundamentally is that the country doesn't want aid. And this is really what your team doesn't seem to understand here, is that in fact this is military intervention due to the fact that they don't want to give their people the aid. But what I'm going to explain later in my debate is that in fact by using by using regional superpowers and the good relationships that they may have through diplomatic means, that this is the best way of actually delivering aid. The second scenario that we see, ladies and gentlemen, is where in fact the type of country that we're talking about thinks that their neighbours are actually very untrustworthy. And this is quite a common place, particularly in continents such as Africa. We see, for example, that Libya, Chad, and Sudan are very untrustworthy neighbours. We see that Chad is funding rebels within Sudan, Sudan is funding rebels within Chad. And so what we see is that within these cases, in fact, regional neighbours may not actually want to help the situation in these countries. And so they would use their political clout in the UN to obstruct this type of motion. The second thing, however, what we see, ladies and gentlemen, is that whatever the justification for militarily intervening into the situation is, it's still a violation of sovereignty. And whatever Team Israel thinks today, sovereignty is taken very seriously in the international community. No, thank you, ma'am. What we see furthermore is that particularly blocs such as the EU take sovereignty very seriously. We see within the case of the American invasion of Iraq that countries such as France and Belgium refused to intervene in Iraq because it was a violation of their sovereignty. The second and more important thing, however, that we see is that the EU bloc is actually one of the main contributors to humanitarian aid in terms of capital. And so not only is it very unlikely that, in fact, the EU is going to throw themselves behind a policy of military intervention and the violation of sovereignty, I'll take in a moment, ma'am, but secondly, that the capital which is needed to provide this humanitarian aid, it's very unlikely that they're actually going to provide it because it goes against what they believe in terms of sovereignty. Yes, ma'am. The
whole world, the whole UN and Security Council ratified the responsibility to protect. Who are you to say they suddenly won't?
Ma'am, I've given you examples of why, for example, countries in the EU will refuse to invade a country's sovereignty, even in cases of human rights abuses, as in Iraq with Saddam Hussein. So what we can see, ladies and gentlemen, is that in fact veto powers present a huge obstruction to the effectiveness of the United Nations intervening force. The second thrust of their argument, however, was around the issue of trust. They claim that these dictators aren't going to trust NGOs because they're agents of the West and they're going to undermine their power. Now, the first thing that we would say is that that's illogical, because NGOs, by their very nature, being non-governmental organizations, often don't have any political ties. When we look at something like the United Nations, ladies and gentlemen, which contributes of member states from political organizations such as governments, then in fact it's much more likely that there's going to be political ties to the United Nations. Furthermore, what we told you is that regional neighbours aren't necessarily trusted. And second of all, ladies and gentlemen, what we see is that often the United Nations as an organisation isn't trusted. If we look, for example, no thank you sir, at examples of Zimbabwe, where in fact the United Nations is seen as a tool of the West. And if we particularly look at the type of scenario that Team Israel was portraying today, which is that of selfish dictators who are secluded from the international community and are not members of things like the United Nations, that is very unlikely that in fact they're going to be willing to simply allow the United Nations to walk into their country with a large intervening force. The second thing we see, however, more importantly, is that often when the United Nations sends in a unilateral force, a multilateral force rather, that's done simply by only one country. Usually it's very strong countries, Western countries such as the United States. And we see an example of Somalia, when the United Nations sent in peacekeeping forces here, the vast majority of the peacekeeping forces were contributed by the United States military. And so what we can see, ladies and gentlemen, is that even though it's done under the auspices of the United Nations, often there's one particular country, often Western states, who are actually the intervening forces. The second thing we see, ladies and gentlemen, is that this side of the House's policy rests under the assumption that, in fact, countries are going to be happy to have multilateral forces intervening. What we would contest, and what they haven't dealt with today, is that in fact, an intervention is actually very insulting to the country. It violates their sovereignty. It says that they aren't able to have capacity to implement policies over the people. What we can see is that in fact, this side of the House has a very unrealistic perception about what is going to happen when in fact these invading forces go into this country. So now that we've established that in fact the United Nations isn't actually a very effective method at all, what we have to look at is what our policy is, what our cases tell you. In fact, if the aid isn't getting there, what effects are they going to be? What they haven't dealt with today, gentlemen, is first of all the idea that in fact retribution is going to be taken by the government because they are going to be angry, and civilians are going to be further, their lives are going to be further jeopardized by that. The second thing that they haven't dealt with is this idea of collateral. That in fact, whenever there's civil conflict, whenever there's war, there's a damage to infrastructure, and this is inherently damaging to in fact the provision of aid in these particular countries. The second thing we see, ladies and gentlemen, is that the case study that they gave us of the types of countries which are accepting aid because of international exposure was China. And they said that quite a few years ago, China wasn't integrated in the international community, but now that they are integrated in the international community, they're happy to accept aid. And what we would contest is that this is still true for countries like Myanmar. What we would say is that the most damaging thing that we can do is to intervene militarily and sour political relations with those particular countries, ladies and gentlemen. And if we look at the case study of Myanmar, what we see, ladies and gentlemen, is that because nobody intervened militarily, and because we had negotiations and diplomatic ties with the country, slowly but surely Myanmar did allow aid to seep into the country. The second thing that we see, ladies and gentlemen, is that in fact Team Israel had a very black and white idea about how this case works. Because it's not simply that there's no aid or a lot of aid. What we see in Myanmar is that there was, for example, Buddhist monks organizations who were administrating aid in the humanitarian crisis. Furthermore, in Zimbabwe we see that there's religious groups who are administrating this aid. And so even if we don't intervene militarily, aid is still being accessed by the people who are in need. Furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, it is able to access them in the long term, which is actually the most important part of today's debate. So because Team Israel didn't prove why in fact the policy is effective, the motion must fall to our side of the House. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for that speech. We're now going to move to the summary speeches for each side, beginning, as is usual, and quite by the rules, with the opposition team, and that is going to be Daniel.
So how best do we address proposition's attitude towards the cost raised by opposition side of the House in terms of their policies intervening in humanitarian crises? Now, the whole of their attitude can really be encapsulated by the second speaker's first response to it, which is, well, who cares about these few people who are going to die when we can intervene in these cases? And in there is the implicit concession that our consequences are in fact going to take place. Now, what we fundamentally aren't going to contend here is that if you are in a situation where you have a natural disaster, and you add on top of that some kind of conflict as well, then you have in fact made the situation worse. And that is where our model is in fact better than proposition's model. So I'm going to be dealing firstly with the issue of consequences, and secondly with the issue of intervention, the two issues, the two premises that Israel had to deal with here. Now, under our model, though our model didn't need to stand, honestly, for us to rest on this debate, for this debate to be rested on our side, we had some aid going through, and we have a sustainable political measure of dealing with things. However, under their policy, and what they failed to deal with so far, is that it's harder to deliver aid, it destroys your ability to deliver aid in the future, it has other consequences in terms of the regional instability, and destroys sustainable context in which you can deliver aid. Now, Their response to this is premised on two premises that I will deal with just now. But it's odd, really, for a team that wants to care about the weakest of the weak to simply brush off all these consequences at first and simply to say, oh, they don't matter as long as we're helping the people in the rubble, which you're not necessarily doing in the first place. So let's deal with the justification that Israel came with their case. Now, they came up with the consequences that we dealt with our case. And they said basically that the UN is a trusted body, that it goes in, it's not about territory, and that's all very well and good. What they're not dealing with is what they don't want to deal with on this side of the house, apparently, is the fact that they're intervening. They're going into a hostile government's territory. They're going into a territory where people don't want you fundamentally, and it's quite as easy for them, as my third speaker said, for them to demonize the UN as a tool of the West, and for them to say that the UN is horrendous, and that the UN is infringing on their sovereignty, as it is for any other body. We've seen cases where people aren't going to want to accept aid in the first place, then why would they accept an opposing military force that is there to oppose their soldiers from preventing aid to get through? And the whole analysis about why people would want these people in the first place is inherently flawed on the case of the UN, and also in the case of this threat that they presumed. Because we showed you again and again, in fact I showed in my first speech, where is this mechanism that they presume that a dictator is necessarily going to want to give in aid simply because you threaten him? I said at my first speech, look, dictators want to protect themselves, they're going to want to militarize themselves and make sure they've got the best chance of going to war with the countries no matter what. In fact, they often distrust their neighbors, and that is why they go to war with them. And fundamentally, this rational actor that they posit doesn't exist in the real life, as we've given you in cases of Myanmar, who could be crushed by China overnight, but yet they still hold out, they're still a military junta, and they didn't deal with any of that analysis that we presented as to why it's more likely for a dictator to want to accept aid and avoid intervention as opposed to him to resist the intervention. So they didn't want to deal with the intervening case, and they tried to have it both ways, because they did say, oh no, they did try to prove that it was going to be accepted by the dictators. So there's an inherent admission, of course, through them dealing with the UN, and through them trying to show that people would accept the UN, that there's a risk here. That if you were to do it unilaterally, then there's all these costs, which I showed you in my first speech, which haven't been dealt with by that side of the house. Secondly, I showed you in my first speech from the outset, and we've held this line consistently, that the military itself is unprepared to deal with these kind of situations. If the world's greatest military, such as the United States, can't maintain a humanitarian sound situation in Iraq and Afghanistan, then why on earth would the United Nations, which is vastly less prepared to do so, be able to do so? So what we found, ladies and gentlemen, with propositions policy, is that it's fundamentally ineffective, is that it harms the people that it means to help simply because of the nature of the situation on the ground, because you're intervening. That's what they don't want to deal with. The fact that they're intervening in hostile territory which doesn't want them, which sparks belligerence, which damages, which has collateral damage, which kills civilians, which are the people who are trying to help, which destroys your ability to deliver aid in the future through the destruction of infrastructure, which embroils it in conflict, which creates regional conflicts as opposed to localized conflict. Because of all that matter, all these attacks from opposition that have stood, that haven't been dealt with by proposition, this motion must fall.
Okay, I thank Daniel for that speech and call upon Moshe to conclude the case for Israel.
A father is beating his child. He's smacking him around, he's smashing his head with glass bottles, he's sticking his hand in the oven. It's horrible. The police have arrived. They're standing outside the door. They're ready to stop the evil. But the opposition says no. We must stand and watch. And ladies and gentlemen, on the proposition, we can't accept that. That's the situation we have today, ladies and gentlemen, only on a much larger scale. Myanmar was struck by a cyclone. Hundreds of thousands were starving, dying of disease. Bloated bodies floated down the river, and aid, the very thing that could save these people these lives, was sitting on the border, ready to be delivered. But the military junta said, no, we simply can't allow it. The CIA agents, in the form of Red Cross workers, are far too dangerous. And the question is, what do we do in this case? We have a dilemma here, and how do we act? Both teams agreed that they want to help. Both teams care about these people, and both teams agreed that it is morally justified, the action we want to take. Both teams agree that sovereignty is not enough, and that in the cases of disasters such as this, we need to move in. So the issue of whether this action is morally justified fell completely to our side, with no contention from the opposition. The only question was whether it's really effective. And so the problem is that if the opposition agree that they want to help these people, then what they really have to prove is that whatever plan they have is going to save more lives than whatever plan we have. They have to show that there is a better way that will save more people. Did they do this, ladies and gentlemen? The answer is no. All we heard from them was negotiation. We can't possibly invade, we need to use negotiation instead. But ladies and gentlemen, we never heard from them why negotiation would possibly be more effective than military intervention. They themselves admitted that negotiation is too slow, because once a cyclone strikes, then that's it. If you don't get in there and give food to these people, then hundreds of thousands are going to be dead within a month. And negotiations take way too long. We didn't really hear any analysis of why negotiation was a better plan than military intervention. All right, fine, so they don't have any better solution. So what they fell back on was trying to prove that our plan, in and of itself, would somehow kill more people than the hundreds of thousands that we're moving in to save now. They tried to show that in the long term, by souring political relations with this nation, which are already in the toilet, we might want to stress, we're somehow going to, in the future, kill not only all the cyclone victims that are currently waiting to be saved by us, but thousands and thousands of more as well. So let's quickly, in order to end the debate, go over the few problems they had with the effectiveness of our plan. Now, because that's really what the main class of the debate was. So the first problem they brought up in the first speech was that it's expensive, and obviously that's laughable, because we don't care, it's human lives. The second class of the debate was that the conflict will escalate over territory, but ladies and gentlemen, as we rebutted that quite effectively, because it's the United Nations. They're the only group in the world who don't care about territory. All they want is to help. And finally, we got to the main problem they had, was that through military intervention, we will sour political relations with this country. The main problem of that was apparently that it will hurt our chance of giving aid in the future. But ladies and gentlemen, the fact is political relations with these nations are as bad as they can possibly be. Obviously, they don't trust other nations, even to the point where they're allowing NGOs into their borders. These nations are isolationist, paranoid regimes. Our relationships with them are as bad as possible. And what is the point of these relationships anyway? The bottom line is to help. And if we have tried everything we can, if we have attempted to negotiate with them, if we have begged on our knees to let them allow NGOs into their borders, and still they refuse, and still they allow their people to die, then the question is, do we stand on the border and watch helplessly, or do we move in, give these starving people the aid, and then move out and realize that the lives we have saved justify our actions?